Hello again. I don't have copies of my books here with me, but if you look on page 90, you can at least see one of them. You can see if you look on page 90 of this booklet, you'll be able to see one of them here. Okay. I'll be very brief. I recently published a couple of books, tell you a bit about them. One book is called The Imperfect City on Architectural Judgment. Judgment is an extremely important part of our lives. In fact, I would suggest that perhaps everyone in this room, when she or he walks down the street, she or he is always correcting buildings, changing them, making them taller, broader, cutting off parts, or replacing them in their entirety. So architects judge as a matter of daily practice. That's part of how they are. Their formation does them. But if we look a little bit deeper into that, we realize that actually architects judge buildings based on two large sets of criteria. One set is internal to architecture. Another set is actually external to architecture. I'll mention them briefly. The book goes through and evaluates a lot of these criteria and actually judges them. Because many of the ways in which we have been judging architecture in modern times is flawed, deeply flawed. Architects make the most sweeping judgments based on the scantiest, smallest of information. So architects therefore should look at architecture, if they wish, from the exterior and from the interior. An example of looking at architecture from the interior is architectural proportions, is character, architectural typology. That's an example of criteria which are internal. An example of criteria which are external, and here is where the problems occur for the past 100 years or so, is that architecture is associated to all sorts of other related fields, but they are external to it. They are on the periphery. Yet they determine it. For example, the idea of a philosophy of history. A second point is the idea of philosophy of modernity. A third point is the idea of associating architecture with political thought. A fourth idea is the idea of mimetic rivalry. And I'll go through these things very, very briefly. One of the most important justifications that architects make regarding what to practice is based on a philosophy of history. Architects might not necessarily be philosophers of history, but when architects presume to essentially judge a building for it to be modern or non-modern, they make a judgment on architecture based on a philosophy of history. So I go through the book through all sorts of theories that actually lead to this apotheosis of modernism. And one of these importance actually is the retreat nowadays of historicism. As you recall earlier, I defined historicism as a philosophy of history, which is actually historical determinism. And that determinism has been written into various architectural histories. I'm not sure about the young students in this particular room, but I would venture to say that most of the people who are perhaps my age have gone to school being taught historicism. That actually there's a certain teleological, teleos meaning determining line, governing by an end result, a certain teleological development of history, which is leading to the apotheosis of the present time. Interestingly, for modernism may reject historical development, but they would love to be used by history to justify their position, which is an interesting note about that. So I go through the details about how one therefore takes a look at the retreat of grand narratives such as historicism as one way to actually justify architecture. And in the book I propose a new and yet old way to actually look at architecture, a new way to study architectural history. And that new way is based on three important categories, type, character, and style, understood in this context. Looked at it briefly, there are fewer types than one can imagine. There are probably about 7 or 8 types, from which hundreds and thousands of combinations can derive. There are few types, there are more characters than types, there are more styles than characters, but they're all linked. So I propose this other way of studying architectural history based on type, character, and style. Because here's one proposition. We have for decades formed our opinion as architects. We have formed our opinions based on scholarship produced by historians. It's got a lot of problems, and it's given us a lot of very important material as well. But can we, for a moment, can we say basta for a little bit and simply propose a way to study architectural history which is not related to the ways historians wish to classify things? How about an architectural history based on the way architects might operate? On character, type, character, and style. This is a new proposition, new and yet old proposition to actually study architectural history. So that's one aspect of the book. A second aspect is the philosophy of modernity, which is a very important thing. Modernity, as Adorno has reminded very, very carefully, is less a chronological position and more an aesthetic position. So I go through what are the theories of modernity and how they actually justify and not justify architectural form. And I outline in this particular book that the idea of modernity really has less to do with certain forms and more to do with the differentiations of these forms. If you look at what happened in the 18th century, not only in architecture, in the arts, in politics, in philosophy, in fact, in what's known as the big three, what Plato called the true, the beautiful, and the good, very overestimated and now underestimated sets of categories. If you look at these three categories, which are fantastic, the true might include science and religion. The beautiful might include the arts, architecture. Yes. The good might include politics, yes, ethics, and the way we live together. These are important. These are the big three sort of categories. These three categories in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, differentiated. It's a very interesting point because they, for a long time, had been held, especially in Western Europe, had been held by the power of the church or the state. Either monarchies or states controlled the true, the beautiful, and the good. One of the most interesting parts, one of the most interesting, I think, advancements that Enlightenment thinkers did was to essentially differentiate them. They wanted to separate in the beginning those who held power and those who interpreted truth. I wish we could do that today. But those who held power and those who interpreted truth, if these were separated, then they can differentiate. That's actually, this particular aspect is remarkably important. The new state was born. Slavery was ended, or at least began to be ended. So that brought a lot of dignities. In this case, modernity, as an emancipation of the individual, made an awful lot of important advances. Okay. Now, so differentiations then brought important advances, but differentiations can tend to an extreme too. When something differentiates, it can dissociate. And if it dissociates too much, it can dissolve. So we have these 3 Ds, differentiation, dissolution, differentiation, dissociation, and dissolution. And that's what happened in architecture. So modernity really, at best, and its essence, what is the nature of this thing called modernity? At best, it really is about differentiating all cultural forms to their ultimate fragmentation. Okay? So its essence is about that. It's about differentiating and eventually dissolving many cultural forms. This is one of the big topics in the book. A third topic is architecture and politics. And it doesn't simply mean how we project political content into architectural form, although it includes that. But interestingly, the architect and the politician are called to serve the city. Yes? The architect and the politician are called to serve the city. They do it differently. The politician, if elected, presumably is representing the ethics of a particular society. Yes? And therefore the politicians form, or at least conform, the ethical enclosure of the city. The architects build the city physically. That is the interesting part that actually is to be linked. There is a link to be made on that level between serving the city, meaning serving the public crowd. But there's a very important point here to recall. It is one thing to say that the architect and the politician are called to serve the city. It's another to say that architecture stands for or represents political intentions. That's something else. And as Léon has demonstrated for decades, this is one of the greatest errors that we have had to live with, mainly from modernist scholarship. That is the association of political intentions with architectural form. It actually poses a peculiar set of conclusions here, because that means that one can proceed from the political intention to an architectural form. And it's just absurd to do that. I'll give you a small illustration. There's an interesting building in Rome, Palazzo Cenci Bolognetti, which is the street sort of almost at the foot of the Campidoglio in Rome. Palazzo Cenci Bolognetti was built in the 1920s by Arnaldo Foschini, right? And that was built for the fascist party. Okay, so that was a classicizing building built for the fascist party. In the 1960s, the same building, Cenci Bolognetti, was bought by the Communist Party. And it remains the seat of the communist people. It's the same building. And it's utterly absurd to therefore project any particular political content into that. So that's another aspect of the book. Essentially, how are we called to serve the public realm, the city, both as architects and politicians, and how can architecture therefore, what is it that architecture can present? What can it represent? And I underline the difference between architectural expression and architectural representation. They're not the same thing. I think many dubious associations have happened between the arts, from the arts, have moved from the arts into architecture to actually say that architecture represents something. It's very dubious. In a very general sense, perhaps, yes, but architecture probably expresses. Expression is different than representation. Expression comes from within an art toward society. To represent opposite works in the opposite direction. It goes from society back into an art form. So I explain some of that as well. And then I discuss in great detail in several chapters the idea of architectural character, underlining how architectural character has been treated for centuries in treatises and in architectural, in buildings and architectural discourses as well. Character is a remarkably important notion in architecture that has really suffered tremendously because most architectural historians, and therefore many architects, have followed these historians by actually falling under the spell of considering everything as style. The concept of style has actually pushed aside, with a sleight of hand, the concept of character and the concept of type. And that's a big problem, because we cannot really all use this sort of thing in a stylistic kind of way. Style has its place, though. It's part of composition. That's an important aspect of how we compose buildings. But character is actually much more important first, because one has to distinguish between what is a public building, what is a private building. So character serves the public and the private realms equally. And it's for that reason that we have the vernacular and the classical. Okay? And then from then on, we have to think about how architectural character affects our senses. That's why we call certain buildings grand or small or obtuse or violent and so on. Jean-François Blondel in the 18th century enumerated something like 65 different ways to actually adjectives to use for architectural character, which is a remarkable way to actually, it's inevitable because we must therefore relate to these objects with our senses. So architectural character is a big and important part. Interestingly, Le Corbusier did deal with something like that. Of course, his apprehension of architectural character is reduced to what is essentially reducible from, if you look at what he studied about Rome and about Egypt and so on, he actually is interested only in the cubes and the cylinders, in the cones and the pyramids of those cultures, but nothing else. So there's this notion of character, therefore, as it's treated throughout centuries in treatises and various writings on architecture. At the end, I'll talk about two other things and I'll stop because I think we all need to go to have lunch. There's an important part of architectural judgment which passes almost unnoticed. We all use it, and that's an aspect called mimetic rivalry. Many, many years ago, Léon suggested to take a look at the work of René Girard about mimetic rivalry. And we both read the books on mimetic rivalry and started thinking that this must be totally applicable to the way architects deal with each other. So it's not just rivalry. Because actually, you can look at very architects who are several architects who are very successful professionally, and yet they rival us. So actually, it's something beyond simply the rivalry itself. Briefly, here's what this thing is about. We all desire forms. That's why we are in this room. We all desire architectural form. Second thing, we end up associating our persona with the forms that we prefer, especially the forms that we design, the forms that we make. So this is a second particular problem that anyone who is in the arts and the architecture is actually dealing with it. So the associating of our person with the form is at the basis of mimetic desire, except mimetic desire is actually much more insidious than that. All of us hold someone or some group of people as a model, as an example, which is fine because this is how we learn. We must learn. We learn through imitation, as we've heard a lot through this morning. Except there's something that happens between the would-be teacher and the would-be student. The would-be teacher tells the student, I am flattered, you can imitate me, yes, but you cannot surpass me. Why? Because both the teacher and the student identified themselves, identified their persona with the forms. Tragedy is not far, because they all are identifying their personae with the forms that they have at their disposal. There's mimetic rivalry, and they begin to resemble each other. And the only way to break that would be to have some kind of scapegoat, something that is innocent of the conflict to begin with, that is on which all sorts of evils can be blamed. In fact, can we ask, was traditional architecture and many of its aspects, were they the scapegoat between various warring modernist groups on the turn of the century and others? It might be that traditional architecture was used as a scapegoat. That's another aspect of the book. And finally, a book on which I had the pleasure to cooperate with Léon Krier and Kent Bloomer and others. Finally, there is a value to conflict, isn't it? Our art form, architecture, is replete and full of conflicts. Now, conflicts are one thing, antagonisms are another. Because two people of reason and goodwill may be in conflict, but they may convince each other. They may learn from each other. Antagonism is something else. Antagonism is actually, after antagonism, only one person is remaining standing. And that's what we have an awful lot of in the intestinal, fratricidal world of architecture today. But conflict is important. Conflict helps to build culture. Here I would like to borrow a very small analogy from Kant in his marvelous little book, Universal History of the World, in which he says, if we simply were to live an Arcadian life in peace with nature, with the animals and so on and so forth, then we really wouldn't have been that much different than the animals because there would be no conflicts between us. But isn't the reason for which we advance conflict? So conflict protects culture and conflict destroys culture at the same time. So this important paradox we need to actually come to grips with. Conflicts are very important. And in all sorts of ways, some of the physical way, essentially, any building is in conflict with gravity, yes, all the time. But also conflicts of ideas. So conflicts of ideas build cultures. It's only the antagonisms of ideas that actually we have to beware of falling into because they actually do destroy cultures. These are the effects of reason. And as we said earlier, reason can be reformed.